In this lecture, I want to look at the issue of communication. It's been said that communication is the lifeblood of any relationship. And of course, marriage is our closest, most intimate relationship that we will ever experience. And therefore, communication between husband and wife are key. And maintaining good communication with your spouse is key to maintaining a good marriage. Now, communication needs to be edifying and unifying rather than dividing. And so what I want to look at are a number of things, beginning primarily from Ephesians chapter 4, which has a number of things to say about communication, and then looking at some practicalities. Now, many times, for example, the first principle of unifying communication is to speak the truth. Ephesians 4 verse 15 talks about speaking the truth in love, and in verse 23 it talks about that we are to put on the new self, we are to lay aside our former manner of life, and be renewed in the spirit of our mind. And therefore, verse 25 says, we're to put on the new self, verse 24. Then verse 25, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Now, of course, Paul was writing to the church, but what he says to the Christians in general applies with special force to marriage, because he says, we are members of one another. Well, husband and wife, we are one. We are a new person together. Now, many times we need to understand, many times we hide the truth. We hide the truth when we feel insecure or not accepted. We hide the truth to feel important, to feel significant. We hide the truth sometimes to try and avoid pain or suffering, or to gain pleasure. Fears, either real or imagined, produce falsehood. But the truth needs to be spoken, and it's necessary to be truthful about what we think, what we say, what we do, what we feel and experience emotionally, and what we desire, what we want, what we hope to achieve. Now, we need caution when we're speaking as to how and when to speak the truth, because how and when you say something can be just as important as what you say and why you say it. In fact, saying something in an inappropriate way or at an inappropriate time can cause the other person to misinterpret what you're saying and why you say it. And so, love, as it says in verse 15, we need to speak the truth in love because God is love. If we don't have love as our motive for speaking, then we are misrepresenting God. Even when the truth requires that we say hard things, we must be motivated by love. You may have heard of the phrase tough love. Sometimes we have to say hard things that the other person is not going to accept. But that's why we have to have the motive of love. And so that, because our motive is going to come through in our tone of voice, in our facial expressions, our body language, all that kind of thing. And so we need to, in that regard, another key component for unifying communication is to reconcile daily, because marriages go through seasons. One can have fights or disagreements or so on and so forth. And the truth sometimes is not easy to speak, even when it's motivated by love. People are easily hurt. They can become offended or angry when we speak the truth to them, particularly if it's a truth that they don't really want to hear or admit. And that can be true even when our motives are good. But you see, truth makes us confront realities that we often deny. Um, and we oftentimes fear, we feel a loss of reality. We falsely think that our false ways of thinking, are correct. We hang on to them, and yet they can be very damaging to us. And so, in cases of bad news, you may have heard this concerning bad things that happen. People go through 5 stages of receiving catastrophic news. First is denial. This can't be. We blame others. We rationalize. We justify. Then anger. We want to shoot the messenger, so to say. Then bargaining. We try to save face. Then there's depression or silence. We ask, now what am I to do? And I don't care anymore. And finally, acceptance. We come to the point of accepting that it's time to adjust to the new reality. And, since communication, particularly with your spouse, may involve these kind of things, that's why we need to be good communicators. Now, the Bible calls for us to keep short accounts. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, it says, "Be angry and do not sin, but do not let the sun go down on your anger." In other words, we need to keep short accounts. Now, anger in and of itself is not sinful. Anger and feelings should be acknowledged, not denied. But we need to understand, why am I angry about something? Is the reason for my anger appropriate? Or is it simply my old man, so to say, rearing up? Are we angry because we fear losing security or significance? Are we being unrighteous and hindering the gospel? Am I dishonoring the Lord? Are we angry according to the new man standards? And we need to test our response to our anger. Is it godly? Losing one's temper or becoming verbally or physically violent is sinful. Storing up resentments day after day is sinful. That's why it says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. Delaying reconciliation with someone who has offended you is sinful. Reconciliation should be done promptly. And by the way, we at Ecclesia have an entire book on forgiveness and reconciliation, and a series of video lectures on that, not only looking at the scriptural reasons why this is central to the gospel, but practical ways of how to do it. And again, this is particularly important in marriages because you're living with somebody. And so offenses and hurts can occur on a regular basis. Not admitting our own fault is sinful, and we need the humility to recognize that we are sinners. And we need to take responsibility for problems in our relationships and do our best to make them right. And let me give you an example from my own marriage about not letting the sun go down on your anger. I remember several years ago, my wife and I had an argument about something, and I can't even remember what it was, but we got in bed, and she's lying on her side of the bed, and I'm lying on mine, and first I was turned this way, pointing toward the wall. She was turned that way, pointing towards the wall. Well, then I thought, this is ridiculous. And so we were both kind of lying on our backs then, but nobody was saying anything. And I remember thinking, if she would just open the door, say anything, I'll say, it's all my fault and all that kind of stuff. Well, she didn't. We both fell asleep. We both slept very poorly. But in the morning, first thing I said is, "Oh, darling, I'm so terribly sorry. It was all my fault," and so on. And she said, "No, I was to blame too." You see, that was foolish. I should have said that right away. I let the sun go down on my anger and paid the price all night. Thank God we reconciled and all was well. But you see, you don't store those things up. You need to understand you and your wife are, or husband as the case may be, are a team. You're one. Don't let these little things get out of control. Communicate the truth in love. And so it should be our goal in communication to build up the other person, because unifying communication is other-centered, not self-centered. We should choose our words carefully, thinking about what's best for the other person. You don't run off at the mouth before you shift your brain into gear. Proverbs 18 tells us that words have the power of death and life. So we need to be thoughtful in what we say. Words have different meanings and effects. Not all are beneficial, so be careful. And if you've misspoken, then apologize and move on. We need to speak what is good for edification. Ephesians 4 verse 29 says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear." These things, we may read them, but we need to think of the implications. This applies to marriages more than anything. Now, the need of the moment requires an accurate assessment of the situation and the context. This can be gained by observation and by questions. It's based on an accurate understanding of God's word and an accurate understanding of the situation and of what the other person is thinking and feeling is necessary for properly applying God's word. You see, our overriding concern should be to glorify God in our communication and to edify the person with whom we're communicating, not to glorify ourselves. When those things are our focus, we can fulfill the two greatest commandments, namely, loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor, especially our spouse, as we love ourselves. So, good unifying communication is possible by God's grace through Christ. But let's take a look at a few specifics concerning good communication. You see, I mentioned at the start of this lecture that communication is the lifeblood of any relationship. Now, only when we understand, so first I want to talk about understanding, then listening, and then empathy. Only by understanding the other person and what's important to him or her can we begin to connect with that other person, with our spouse. True connection with the other involves feeling as well as just intellectual understanding. Understanding takes effort. It involves setting aside my own issues and my agenda in order to truly appreciate my spouse's point of view and feelings. Now, so in order to understand the other person well, to connect with the other person, there are four things required for good, genuine communication to occur. The first is time. We need to spend quality time with someone in order to know the person and know him or her well. Getting to know the person breaks down the barriers to effective communication. Secondly is trust. The barriers to genuine communication will not be overcome unless there is trust between the two parties. No one wants to be hurt. Now, things said in confidence, secrets that are exposed, must remain confidential. Nothing can so harm a relationship as the betrayal of a trust. On the other hand, nothing can foster trust as to expose my own vulnerabilities to the other person. Because when I do that, I'm demonstrating that I trust her, or him as the case may be. So time and trust. Third is commitment. In marriage, commitment to your spouse and to the marriage is fundamental. A marriage partner needs to know that his or her secrets are secure and that the marriage is secure, and that the spouse, that I am committed to her for life. And that is why I said in my case, and I think it should be true in every marriage, the word divorce should never be uttered, particularly in times of anger and conflict. That's just off the table. And so time, trust, commitment, and the fourth necessity is transparency. Transparency includes openness, honesty, and vulnerability. In other words, exposing my secrets, exposing my weaknesses, my failures, my needs, and my fears. Because if I can't expose that to my wife, who can I? She loves me. She's committed to me. She wants the best for me. And, so she needs to know what's going on inside of me. I think, I said in the last lecture that I think the key for most of the time, not every time, but for most marriages to really turn around, the primary responsibility for that to happen lies with the husband. And I think in this area of transparency, I think that is particularly difficult, particularly for men. I think women expose their vulnerabilities and their fears and so on and so forth much more readily than men do. So men, we need to work on that. But again, if you can't trust your wife, who can you trust? What kind of a marriage do you have? What is the basis for your marriage, for crying out loud? Because she's not going to hurt you. She's committed to you for life if she's a Christian. Now, transparency really cannot take place unless the other three factors, time, trust, and commitment, are already present. Now, sharing, as a part of transparency, sharing who you are is open, honest, and vulnerable only if you've taken the time, established the trust, and demonstrated commitment. Can you do that? And the other person needs to do that too. This is a mutual thing. But I'll tell you, you establish that deep level of commitment, that deep level of communication, you're not going to have very many problems. And when problems occur, they're naturally going to be taken care of readily. It's going to be taken care of before a huge argument takes place. That's why all of these things you see are connected. Now, to communicate well, we need to determine what we want to say, how we want to say it, including our tone of voice, the volume, the why we want to say it, to express love or affection or anger or whatever it is, and when we want to say it. Now, we need to understand communication is both verbal and nonverbal. Verbal is what we say. Nonverbal is our tone of voice, our body language, our gestures, our facial expressions. And studies show that when there is a disconnect between the verbal and the nonverbal communication, people tend to believe the nonverbal. If I were to say to my wife, I love you, I think this is a great marriage, I don't think she's going to believe me. Why? Look at my tone of voice, look at my face, look at my arms folded like that. No. You see, we got to be aware of this. And all I'm saying is, I'm mentioning these things. Most of us do this naturally, okay? This is intuitively obvious, but we need to analyze and be conscious in our communication, particularly if we've had some problems in our marriage or are having some problems in our marriage, and particularly if we want our marriage to be better. Now, so in order to do this well and communicate well, we need to maintain eye contact with our spouse when he or she is talking, because maintaining eye contact keeps our mind from wandering, and it keeps us, focused on the conversation. Don't listen to your spouse and be doing something else at the same time. If your spouse is talking to you and you're reading a book or a magazine or the newspaper or something or other, and no. If you're doing that, that's telling her you're really not very important to me. This book, this newspaper is more important to me. Or if you're watching TV or whatever, you grunt. No, I mean, if she's saying something important, look at her. I mean, nowadays, it's possible in some situations to be able to put a pause on what you're watching. And I know my wife and I frequently watch movies or something or other, or DVDs, and if we want to say something, we just hit the pause button and talk, and then can resume. Listen for feelings. Ask yourself, what emotion is my spouse experiencing and communicating? Observe body language, and try to restrain yourself from interrupting. Now, when we're listening to our spouse, we need to take the time to listen and pay attention to show, because when we do that, that shows that I value you. I value who you are. I value what you're having to say to me. And it's showing it's more than just listening to the words that are coming out of his or her mouth. It's showing I value and respect the person. Now, listening is a skill that can be learned. There's false listening. You're faking interest. There's selective interesting. You're only listening some of the time or for certain things. There's protective listening. You're not hearing the threatening part. But there's good listening. And that's what encourages good communication. Now, the best kind of listening is what is called active or reflective listening. And active or reflective listening is important because different people, have different communication skills. And so if my wife, for example, is telling me about her hurt feelings, but I'm just focusing on the facts of the situation and, try to give her advice and so on. No, she's likely to become more upset. I need to acknowledge her feelings, okay? And again, I said, oftentimes that's kind of the way men do. You got a problem. Well, here's what you need to do, okay? She may just want me to understand and sympathize with her and get her feelings out, and then we can move on to how to fix the problem. But listening actively, as I said, active listening is a process. We have to be involved in the communication process and not just listen passively. Now, one technique is called reflecting back. And when I say, when somebody's saying something, you reflect back to them. I'm not just saying parroting the words that she just said, but saying things like making summary statements. It sounds to me you're feeling very hurt right now, aren't you? Or as I understand it, or is what you're telling me this? Or you say something, is that right? That may prompt the other person to say, yes, that's right, or no, what I meant was this. And either way, the goal of communication is enhanced. You can ask clarifying questions, things like, are you telling me that this? Or what did you mean when you said XYZ? You can have summary questions of everything you've just told me here. What do you want me to understand the most? Or what do you need from me most right now? You see, a good listener, you're engaged in the process. It's showing that you're paying attention. It's showing either that you're understanding or there's been a miscommunication. So understanding and communication are enhanced. It shows that you're valuing the person. And so a good listener focuses on the meaning rather than on just the words. And so this is important because we all act and respond on the basis of our understanding. If there is a misunderstanding, both parties may not be aware that I haven't understood you properly. But being an active, reflective listener minimizes that possibility. If we accurately understand the other person's point of view, then we can help the person more easily see the flaws in their position and the flaws in my position. And we can be more effective in helping the person solve the issue or work through the problem that they're talking about. And so, again, we need to look for the meaning behind the words and the feelings behind the words. If you're confused and you don't understand, say so. I'm not getting it. Is what you're saying this? You see, because if you're confused, the other person will realize it and can rephrase. Again, use eye contact and listening body language. In other words, it's you don't just sit back like this, but if you're leaning forward, showing that I'm paying attention to you, that is important. So become a more effective listener. Listening and acknowledging other people may seem very simple, but to do it well, particularly when disagreements take place, requires practice and talent. And it's a learned thing. You can learn to be a better listener. Now, I said we need to look for the feeling, or listen for the feelings and the meaning behind the words, because there's a distinction between merely hearing words and hearing the meaning. When we effectively listen, we understand what the person is thinking and feeling from the other person's point of view. It's as if we're standing in the other person's shoes or listening through the other person's ears. That is what's known as empathy. Empathy is about tuning into the other person's thoughts and feelings, whatever they may be, putting yourself in his or her shoes. Empathy is absolutely necessary. It is the glue that holds relationships together. It motivates us to find out and care about the other person's experience. It leads us to ask about their problems, to make them feel supported, rather than simply offloading my own difficulties onto the other person. So empathy is a form of respect and is an indication that I take my spouse seriously, that I love her, that I am one with her, because I'm experiencing what she's saying as best I can through her shoes, through her position. In that regard, let me close this lecture by saying it seldom helps to tell someone, I appreciate your position, or I know how you feel. But you've got to prove it by being willing to communicate with others at their level of understanding. We do this naturally by adjusting our tone of voice, our rate of speech, our choice of words, to show that we're trying to imagine what they're going through at this moment. To genuinely communicate, to reach an understanding, effectively listen, and demonstrate empathy is an important part of what it means to become one, as God intends husbands and wives to be. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about perhaps communication, as I say, is the lifeblood of all relationships. But God is love. We are to love. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the 5 universal ways that demonstrate and show love, and the 5 ways in which people feel that they are loved.